welcome to Trusty Chords, the podcast which aims to celebrate music and those that create it. Anyone who knows me knows that I love a good lyricist, and then that means you should definitely know the great Craig Finn. For the uninitiated, Craig was the man behind the likes of Lifter Puller, and following their split in 2000, he moved from Minneapolis to New York City and, well, didn't do much. That was until he formed the Hold Steady, after being inspired by the likes of Drive-By Truckers. If you've not yet listened to the Hold Steady, then you need to do me a favour, turn off this podcast and go and listen to them right now. I'm going to wait right here. See, that was amazing, wasn't it? Of course, if you're already across their stellar discography, you'd know the sort of power and impact that their performance style and Craig's stunning lyricism brings to the table. While it's just been a couple of years between records for the Hold Steady, Craig has remained active as ever, issuing the exceptional Always Been album only a few weeks ago. It's certainly one that you need to hear right away. This week, I was lucky enough to be joined by Craig for a wonderful chat about his musical history and latest solo record. I will note, however, there were a few audio dropouts from time to time on our chat, but I did my best to make sure they didn't annoy us too much. Anyway, have a listen to Craig Finn's Always Been, have a listen to our chat, and I'll see you at the end of the episode for some general housekeeping. Craig Finn, thank you very much for joining this episode of the Trusty Chords podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So for those who might not recognize your name, could you give me a quick few words on who you are and why we're chatting today?
Well, my name's Craig Finn. I live in Brooklyn, New York, but I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I've been in two bands of note. One was called Lifter Puller, and I was kind of smaller in my 20s. But in 2003, I started a band called the Hold Steady in Brooklyn, New York. And we're 22 years old now, I guess, and have 9 albums to our name. And this coming weekend are celebrating the 20th anniversary of our second album, Separation Sunday, which is the one a lot of people heard for the first time, or possibly the one after that, Boys and Girls in America. But I've also put out 6 solo records, and the most recent of those came out about 3 weeks ago. It's called Always Been, and I made it with Adam Carandacil from the band The War on Drugs, as well as other folks. And so I write songs, and I guess that's why I'm here.
Amazing. And that saves me doing a lot of background information ahead of time. So those are all things I want to touch on. But I guess before we get into contemporary matters, what I'd love to do at the start here is sort of go back in time to where a love of music first formed. So for you, do you have a recollection of your earliest memory of when music actually first resonated with you?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing I saw was the first thing I remember was the Monkees television show, and it, I would watch it. I was under 5 years old when it was on. I think it was already repeats then, in the early 70s, and I was watching. I think I liked the idea that they all got to hang out together. I mean, I think in the show they lived together, but they also just burst into song. And it seemed like a really cool trick to suddenly be able to just play a song. And I think that was my first real like wanting to be in a band. Right after that, within a few years, the Scottish band, the Bay City Rollers, had an American television show on Saturday mornings. And that was also something that just made me like crazy. Watching them play music. A lot of their songs were really catchy. They really stuck with me. And again, it looked like fun to be in a band. And that was the first record. I ended up going down to the department store and buying Bay City Rollers' greatest hits. And that kind of got me into buying records and sort of paying more attention to music and paying more attention to bands.
Right. Yeah, I really do sort of like how, a band like the Monkees is sort of this formative sort of moment as well. And then a band like the Bay City Rollers, because the music you play feels very far removed from both of those. Like I'm not particularly seeing you burst into, SAT or DIY night.
Well, I would say that, when it wasn't that long, big picture, that I got into punk rock, maybe more like 12. And, when I listened to the Ramones and the Bay City Rollers, I do see some similarities. And I know that Blitzkrieg Bop, the Ramones credited Bay City Rollers as an influence, and some of that kind of football chant kind of aspect. I mean, I think the Bay City Rollers were drawing on things like I'm some, glam stuff, Gary Glitter, things like that found its way into punk. So to me, I actually can connect it, although I definitely agree with what you're saying as well.
Yeah, it's a sort of thing where if you aren't actually going on the journey to connect those threads, they feel very disparate, don't they?
Mhm.
Like you mentioned before, sort of like, you have these bands and you're like discovering sort of punk rock in your, I guess, early teens, you're sort of saying.
Yeah.
So were there any sort of like particular bands that you remember sort of in those formative years? I mean, coming from like, Minneapolis, you had some great bands there, like, Husker Du, for example. They're a great example.
Well, that was it. The first I was into the Ramones, and then I was talking about the Ramones with some kid I knew, and he told me to check out the Replacements. And the Replacements were a local band, and I went, and he said he claimed his sister was friends with them, which I don't know if that was true or not. But I went down and I got their record, which was Hootenanny. This was the summer of 1984, and shortly thereafter they came out with Let It Be, which is kind of their classic record. And once I heard the Replacements, I was kind of off to the races. And that, within a month, I'd checked out Husker Du as well. And then I found out you could go to these shows, in Minneapolis, and these bands would play all ages shows. So I started going to as many of those as I could, and everything, the local stuff led me to more national bands, the Descendants, the Meat Puppets, um, you know, Naked Ray Gun from Chicago. Basically, any band that came through, I was interested in. And I really liked sort of noisy guitar, rock, Dinosaur Jr., Replacements, things like that. But I really did like hardcore, because when I went to a hardcore show, pretty much everyone was my age, so there was a social thing to it that I really liked, and I became friends with some of the local hardcore bands um, that were happening, who are much less notable historically than the Replacements or Husker Du, but were happening too.
So for you, when did a love of music first transform into actually playing music? Like when did you pick up an instrument or, start writing your first songs?
Well, I got a guitar when I was about seventh grade, so pretty much right around the time I got into like the Ramones and all that. And I think the two are kind of connected because I knew I liked the idea you could play, that you could, with punk, you could kind of get your feet wet quickly, meaning like you could learn a Ramones song and get it going better than you could learn a Led Zeppelin song, for instance. And almost immediately, like, right around that time, historically again, Van Halen was a pretty big band. And a lot of my friends who were starting to play guitar, they wanted to be Eddie Van Halen. Like they really wanted to play fast and, do solos. And I never had that bug. I just wanted to write songs. So I would try to write songs like once I had a couple chords down, I would try to write songs and it would just be in the style of the bands I liked. It would be trying to ape them. But it kind of taught me about songwriting.
While a lot of folks would probably know you in a contemporary sense from like the Hold Steady, you rose to fame, for lack of a better word, as part of Lift a Puller, back in the back majority of the '90s. So, personally, was Lift a Puller your first band, or were there more before it?
I had a band in high school that did more covers. And then briefly had a band for one semester in college. But Lifter Puller was kind of the first real band, certainly the first band that went out of town, that had aspirations. And it was a cool band. We worked really hard, but we were in Minneapolis, and it was before the internet, really, before the internet as we know it. So, things were very different in the geographic sense, in that we got to the point in Minneapolis where we could draw quite a few people. But, if we left town and went to Chicago, which is the nearest big city, it might be more like 35 people. Um, so it was definitely a local thing. And what now you can get your hand on all that music. So people kind of say, oh yeah, I love Lifter Puller. But like, a lot of our shows weren't very big, but it was a good band. It's people I'm all still friends with. And it was like the thing about Lifter Puller that was really cool is that we worked really hard. Like, I mean, it's a weird, and maybe it's a weird thing to say, but that's, I think, the thing I'm most proud of is that like we rehearsed a lot and we were very ambitious. And a lot of the bands around us, no offense to them, but they weren't that ambitious. Um, so like, I think that like I look back and that's something I'm really proud of with that band, but it certainly never had the um breakout that the Hold Steady did.
So, like you mentioned that the band were ambitious, but I guess what were those ambitions? Like, were you guys aiming for some sort of like at least underground success or some underground
Yeah,
notoriety? Like, was that the
yeah,
plan?
we were trying to play as many shows as possible, but we didn't have like a label or an agent or anything. So I was like booking all our tours on the payphone at my work on my lunch break. And we were doing good. We were like making our own, putting out our own music and connecting. Like when we played, I think people like, I think if we would have stuck around for another year, things would have like turned. But by that point, we were kind of exhausted and then also like behaving poorly. Like also I think we were just we never kind of got over the thing where like um going on tour didn't feel like a party, and thus things just kind of got weird.
That's completely fair. So, Lifter Pulse, they split in 2000, and I think you moved to New York, I believe. Then a few years later, you and Tad formed the Hold Steady. So, what was the aim with the Hold Steady here? Like, how did this, in your mind, differ from what had come before?
Well, the Hold Steady really had limited um ambitions. Just because I coming out of Lifter Puller, I was kind of like, well, it seems like the trouble all happened when we started to try to play shows. So I'm serious, like when I say like the Hold Steady talked about not playing shows and never recording. We were just gonna like get together and play our songs in our space. And then of course we decided to play a show, and then we played two shows, whatever. And then, the thing about New York is things can happen quickly in New York.
Sure.
And like once we started playing and people started showing up, all of a sudden the people who were showing up and writing about it were like national people rather than local people. And we got started to get all these opportunities. And I mean, I think we started '03. Our first tour in Australia was '06. So things like, happened quick um compared to compared to what it was like in Lifter Puller. I mean, things by that point we had two records out, and we formed in '03, put out a record in '04, put out a record in '05, put out a record in '06, and had we're touring internationally immediately, very quickly. And the experience was much different.
I mean, no one could no one could accuse you of being lazy, that's for sure, with how quickly things were taking off.
No, no, I mean, my idea was always that we had to keep working, and it still is kind of. I mean, I still think that like um taking any kind of break as an artist is um I don't know, I just don't. Maybe like I think there's probably reasons you might want to do it for marketing reasons, but I don't think for artistic reasons it's positive.
Yeah, and that actually serves as a nice little sort of segue because obviously there is so much I could touch on in regards to the Hold Steady. There's so many brilliant albums, but I do want to touch on your solo work because you've released the exceptional Always Been recently, and it is a truly stellar record. I listened to it again yesterday just to sort of refresh my mind, and it's gorgeous, honestly. But I guess for you, what does Always Been say about who Craig Finn is in 2025? What does it represent for you as a musician, a performer, or a lyricist?
I mean, I think it's like in some ways it's kind of like, it's what we're talking about. It's like I, like I've always been writing songs. I've always been and these are the songs. These are the songs of where I'm at today. I mean, I think that, you know, sometimes people say like like, this is a record about growing older. Well, like they're all about growing older because every year we age, our perspective changes. And I think like when you create something like an album, you're kind of like marking your height against the wall in an emotional sense. And so, I think that the title in some way always been because I've always been Craig Finn, I've always been writing songs, but this is where I'm at right now, and a lot of the characters on the record are people that are, closer to my age. And these are the stories I'm that are on my mind right now. These types of people in these kind of situations. And it is about a desire to just keep working. And the Hold Steady's like, as I said, 22 years. So we don't, to do things with all six of us sometimes takes um it doesn't move as fast as it did in 2005, but like I no matter what, I always just sort of want to be pushing forward and creating.
See, I'm curious when it comes to musicians who have a solo career alongside a larger project because the Hold Steady is still going steady, but
Yeah.
and you have those records. But how do you sort of differentiate between the songs that you write? Are you someone who writes to a brief, i.e., the Hold Steady of a new album, better write some songs, or do you just sort of write lyrics and say if they work for this project or this project?
Well, it's kind of self-selecting because in the Hold Steady, almost always, there are a few exceptions, but almost always I'm writing to music that Tad Franz or Steve give me.
Mhm.
So by doing that, that's the Hold Steady. Now, when that music comes to me, it's generally bigger, meaning, it's big guitar riffs, it's big rock songs. And so I think like when I hear that music, I tend to write bigger stories. People are doing bigger, more desperate things. People are getting shot, people are crashing cars, et cetera, where with the solo work, I oftentimes have the story. Um, and it might be two chords, might be this two most basic chords like G and C, and I'll just kind of carve out a song from that because I already know the story and I already have the story. Um, and I think that when I do the solo songs, they're way more often people that the type of people I know, should I say, or maybe closer to myself, more, they tend to be smaller stories, character studies, and, more of the people I see myself in, real life.
Because yeah, that's definitely something I do realize. Oh, sorry, definitely something I do recognize while listening to the solo work is that the stories feel a lot more intimate and they feel a lot more sort of, I guess. I'm going to repeat myself when I say intimate, really, but like, because like probably about a decade ago, I spent about a year living in Oklahoma, and just
Mhm.
while I was sort of living there, sort of like getting to know some of the people, it's like you just sort of like start to realize like all these sort of like interesting little like intricacies of how people live, and like coming from Australia to Oklahoma, I was able to sort of like use as a case study a bit more, and it's that sort of intimacy I sort of feel in an album like Always Been, where I'm sort of like I feel like I know these people, and they feel like they could have been people I was living near, and it feels very relatable, and I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing sometimes because not all the lyrics are positive, but yeah.
No, I mean it's vulnerable. I think it's more vulnerable in that I'm making up things, and that are seem, even if it's a fictional story, it's a very believable story. No one's parachuting off of,
Of course.
out of a jet, to rob a bank or something like that, um but yeah, and I think that like I've on this record especially, I went deeper into sort of the character development. Like I wrote a lot on some of the characters in a way, just prose that didn't make it into the record. Like, just so I knew the people better.
Mm,
And that was really an interesting process and helped me sort of see the world and kind of create the world.
yeah. So you see, when I first discovered your music, it was actually because I was talking to someone about the Mountain Goats. Because I'm a huge fan of the Mountain Goats. I've got a Mountain Goats tattoo and all that sort of thing. And I remember someone saying to me, "Hey, if you like John Darnielle, you should hear Craig Finn." And I remember thinking, "Oh, good, someone else who writes amazing sort of lyrics." And and I guess that's sort of my way of leading into like asking you, how do you sort of view your own songwriting? Because I mean, people love the words and the vivid imagery that you create, but how do you sort of view it? Do you view yourself as being someone who is accomplished as a songwriter, or are you still sort of, chasing the elusive, like, trying to master the game sort of thing?
I think I'm chasing. I mean, I always feel like you're chasing. There's some part of me, and like I do think I'm confident about my abilities as a songwriter. And I'm like a lyric writer, and I think that, my peers are people like John, who's a master. So,
Absolutely.
so I feel pretty good. Like I'm confident, but there is some sort of like always, I think, some human part of you that's like got a little bit like where your music, like I can be a total fan of the Mountain Goats or the Weaker Thens or, other lyricists that I think are just brilliant. And my music always sounds like me to me. Um, so you can never get quite out of your head. But I don't know. I mean, I think that I I guess I think that one thing, if I was, to sort of need to calm myself down, uh, or if I was feeling bad about myself, I would look to some of the people that I most admire songwriting wise have become peers and friends. Whether that's John Darnielle or John Sampson or Patterson Hood or Jason Isbell, whoever. There's others I'm not thinking of, but like that I'm like, okay. Um, if those guys are paying attention, that's
Because, like, I mean, I've listened to so many accomplished lyricists, such as yourself, and as a musician myself, it's had such a profound impact, But as a result, it sort of ruined me as a songwriter because I always look at my work and I say, well, is this a line that Craig Finn, like John Daniel, or like David Berman would write? It becomes a sort of very labored, and this becomes a very labored segue for me to ask, do you have a particular way that you sort of approach songwriting? Do you tend to cleanse the palette ahead of time to avoid outside influence, or do you sometimes seek external influence? Or is it a case of whatever works for you?
whatever works. I mean, I think like there's this thing that Jeff Tweedy wrote a book about creativity that I thought was really good. And one thing he said is like when he feels stuck, he kind of goes looking for stuff, and it might be like watching a film or reading a book. Might not be like, listening to his favorite songwriters, but I think that I like that a lot. I think like if I go and read a novel, for instance, like that's that's helpful to me because I can kind of go deep into my head.
Mm.
And when you read a novel, you kind of disappear into that character in a cool way. And so that's one thing. But when you're talking about like would John Darnielle write that line? Would David Berman write that line? At some point it's just I think for it's finding your own voice, and because David Berman would write a line that John Darnielle wouldn't write and vice
Exactly.
versa.
Yeah.
Um, and so, eventually it's just through the power of repetition and work that you find there's stuff that Bob Dylan says, that doesn't scan on the page as being brilliant. And then you hear it in his voice and it kind of knocks you down because you've heard him say other other things over the past decades that have also knocked you down.
Yeah. No, that is completely true. And I guess it's a bit of a final question before we get to our like the final segment of the podcast. You know, like the whole set, you've obviously toured Australia quite a bit over the years, but I don't think you've ever played here as a solo artist. Is there ever any chance of that happening at any point?
I do hope so. I mean, I'm not like I can't like reveal dates. I don't have any.
That's why
But
you
I
can't
hope,
reveal them.
I certainly would love to. I would certainly love to, and I would say if there's any promoters listening, I would love to come to Australia. I think that would be a dream.
Yeah.
And then, I'd love to make it happen, but I don't have any imminent dates.
Amazing. Well, I feel like I should get down to the portion of the podcast from which its namesake is derived. So, Trusty Chord sees me follow the 1, 3, and 5 structure of a standard chord. I ask about one artist that's been impactful, 3 albums that have been influential,
Mhm.
and 5 songs you can turn to. It's one for the music nerds out there. So, my first question for you here, Craig, who is one artist that has inspired you the most, whether it be personally or creatively?
So I'm gonna say, I mean, I think I'm gonna say Bruce Springsteen, which may seem obvious, but I don't think there's anyone else that who's um impressed me more with his body of work, but also his dedication to performance and just say that he's affected so many people. When you go to see his shows, there's just, tens of thousands of people who have had a relationship with his music. And I'm usually moved to tears if I go see Bruce Springsteen, so I'm going to go with that one.
Well, that's completely fair. I mean, there, as I always say, there's a reason he is the boss. Like, you don't get a moniker like that without having an impact that's affected hundreds of thousands, I mean, millions of people, really. My next question for you here, what are the three albums that have impacted you the most? This could be albums that you're always throwing on, or something that have been integral to your musical evolution over the years.
Okay, so I would say Let It Be by the Replacements. That was the first, that was just like, that's when people ask what's your favorite album, that's the one I say.
Hmm.
And it's got my favorite song of all time. Well, I'm gonna hold that. But it's just a record that came to me at the right time. Just the right time. I was not doing great as in school and as a person. I was in, 13, and it's a rough age. And I think that record made me feel like there was something else out there. I'll go with that. I'm also going to say, I have to, the yin to the yang as a Minneapolitan, is I have to give you a Husker Du record. And I'm going to go with Zen Arcade, because that was the first one I was super into. It's a double album, and I think it's again, it's got so much great songs, such a ambitious body of work that you were like, it's a punk band, but they have a double album, and it's like got a concept behind it, and it just again made me aware of so much that was possible. And I love the dual songwriting. Bob Mould, who I just got off tour with, and Grant Hart, who's rest in peace. Just beautiful back and forth songs, and really exciting sonically. And from there, I'm going to go way ahead to the early 2000s, and Drive By Truckers, Southern Rock Opera, because I heard that record, and I was not a huge Americana guy. Some guys I worked with were into it, and I gave it a chance, and I was blown away. The songwriting, the storytelling. I went and saw them live. Their live show was so good. I said, I have to be in a band again, and I started the Hold Steady. So, um, Southern Rock Opera to me is a life changing record, and again, the ambition behind it, the double album, the story, etc. So I'll go with those three.
So we can thank Drive By Truckers for the Hold Steady existing as we know it today.
Yeah,
It's amazing.
that's true. That's true.
Actually, just on the topic of Husker Du and Bob Mould, so my band frequently covers Husker Du's. I forgot the name of the song. This is embarrassing. It'll come to me. I don't want to know if you're lonely. We're always covering that one just because it's
Oh
such
yeah,
a
great
it's a
song.
crowd pleaser. And earlier this year, I was lucky enough to actually be backstage at a Bob Mould solo show. So it was a minimal crew, and I walked in backstage, and he was just sort of in his little dressing room, just playing music by himself. And it was just, as being such a fan, it was this weird moment of intimacy where it's just sort of like it's a moment that average fans don't see, where you sort of see a musical hero at their core, just sort of honing their craft and seeing them just in the very act of performing. And it was such an eye-opening moment for me as a music fan and as a performer as well. But such a wonderful musician.
I just, from doing that tour with them, I had like the very uh very profound nights where I was like, dealing with all the other shit that I have to, that of my own performance, and then, dealing with merch. It was a small tour, so I was dealing with a lot, getting paid, etc. And then sometimes I'd come in and be like, oh my God, I'm on tour with Bob Mould.
Mm,
And I'd like sit there and watch, 7, 8 songs and be like, this is incredible. Like, like I was kind of in my own head all day,
mm,
but I'm out here with my hero, and just, being able to lose myself in that for a few, half hour every night was amazing.
So my next question here is I'd love to know the five songs that you can always turn to, whether it be for comfort, for excitement, anything at all, your five trusty songs. But before I actually formally ask you that, a few months ago I actually had a guest on this podcast who was it was Tim Stewart of the band from Brisbane in Australia called Scream Feeder. His number one artist was Husker Du, and one of the albums that he picked was Almost Killed Me by the Hold Steady. And one of
Yeah.
his favorite songs that he picked was Killer Parties by the Hold Steady. So clearly you're in very fine company, and it's also very rare to actually be chatting to someone whose own songs have been picked as part of this segment. So
Very
I would
cool.
love to know what your five trusty songs are, Craig.
All right. Well, let's start with my favorite song of all time, which I almost gave away, which is "I Will Dare" by the
Mm.
Replacements. First song on Let It Be. I think it's just a beautiful romantic song. If you will dare, I will dare. Fall in love. Meet me anytime, any place. I think it's the song that puts me in a great mood immediately and makes me it's just, I don't know, there's something absolute magic in that song to me. Number two, I'm gonna try to sort of mix this up. This is a little off the top of my head because I don't, but Straight Into You by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds. Nick Cave is another artist that I'm like just insanely obsessed with. His work ethic is one reason. I just love what he does and how he commands the stage, but also that he seems to just be so committed to his art, and that's, to me, that's one of the songs that's just at the him at his peak. I'm gonna go with a Drive By Trucker song, just because I've been listening to him a lot lately, and Zip City, which is a Mike Cooley song rather than a Patterson Hood song. But I love songs that are funny, and I think that the best songwriters are funny in some way. I mean, I think whether it's John Darnielle or Bob Dylan or Warren Zevon or Mike Cooley from the Drive-By Truckers, there's always got to, there's something funny. And Zip City, I think, is just a really, I remember listening to it for the first few times and before I had ever met Mike and being actually really scared of him, which I think is a good reaction to have from a rock song. And then let's see. I'm trying to come up with something else off the top of my head. Well, you know what? I'm gonna go I'm gonna go with Saturday Night by the Bay City Rollers, just because that was the first one I loved, and it's another one of it may not have the depth of a Dylan song, but it does it does get me
I
somewhere
mean,
every
great
time.
songs don't need depth as long as they're good songs and they
Yeah, I
make you
think so.
and they
I
make
mean,
you
I think
remember what you love
so.
about
I mean,
music.
I think you can bring your own depth to them if you live your life to them.
Totally.
Um, the other one, what are we at? Five?
That's four songs. We have one left.
Okay. Uh, walking far. I think uh, walking far from home, I believe, is the title of the song. It's Iron and Wine,
Hmm.
and it's a beautiful, beautiful song, and it's one of my favorites. It's sort of a list. Um, um, of things he sees, and it's just such a gorgeous song. And I know I'm not out of it. I know I'm off of it, but I I also want to give. I just thought of one that I love, which is Ezra Furman's "Love You So Bad." So that's five, five, and 5.5.
That is completely fine because, as I always say to people, it's my podcast. I make the rules. If you want an honorable mention, it is all yours.
Yeah, yeah, that's just a beautiful song that I was listening to the other day and thinking like that is just a plus song.
Absolutely. And it was also actually a very sort of topical reference you mentioned before about, great to see some humor in music with like, Warren Zevon, for example, who was only just yesterday, or is it today for you? I don't remember all this times, inducted in the
Got
Rock
into
and Roll
the
Hall of
Rock and Roll
Fame.
Hall of Fame,
Such a,
which I have to
it,
wonder if he'd care about.
I was thinking the same
But
thing actually, because it's definitely a contentious topic. And I mean, I was very surprised to see folks like Jack White actually sort of saying, oh, happy to be in here when he's the sort of person who you'd feel doesn't really care too much. But Warren Zevon
yeah,
is
I mean,
well
the thing
deserved.
about these things, I think, is that it's always nice to be recognized,
Of course.
like I think that the right at this point, the right thing to do is to graciously accept them.
Of course. Well, here is hoping that one day we'll be seeing Craig Finn, the Hold Steady, and Lift a Puller in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But in the meantime, Craig, I want to say thank you so very much for your time today and for being part of the Trusty Chords podcast.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to Trusty Chords. If you listened to this episode and enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it if you were able to take a few moments to like, follow, share, and review this podcast on your preferred platform of choice. As always, no obligation, but I'm forever grateful if you do. As always, I'm over on Instagram and Facebook at Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word, and I've also got a blog on my website, which is tylerjenke.com. That's tylerjenke/Trusty Chords Podcast, all one word. Over on the site, I've got a blog which also features all of the songs chosen by my guests each week, along with a link to a playlist where you can hear all the songs as well. You can also find a link to the Buy Me a Coffee platform where you can throw me a few dollars to keep this podcast running if you feel so inclined. Lastly, I need to thank Craig Finn for spending some time with me this week, and also Joe from Joe Corbett Publicity for helping to organise our chat as well. But once again, thank you kindly for listening, and I hope to see you all again next week as I continue to celebrate music and those that create it.